Have you ever wondered what it takes to melt the heart of a ruthless millionaire? In the bustling streets of the city, a powerful, cold-hearted CEO, Henry Stewart, rushed to another board meeting until he noticed two boys holding up their sick brother on the sidewalk, and everything he thought he cared about stopped making sense. Henry Stewart was a man who walked like time owed him something. Each morning began with silence, speed, and structure. His days were mapped in minutes, not hours, and his mind was always 5 steps ahead of the present. That morning, like every other, he moved through the business district with his phone in one hand, and his purpose sharpened to a point. He barely noticed the people he passed, or the early spring wind tugging at the corners of his tailored blue suit. He had a 9 a.m. meeting with international investors, a 10:15 call with legal, and a dozen things in between that would keep his empire humming. He was halfway to his waiting car when something unusual stopped him. Could this moment change his life forever? It wasn't the sound. There was always noise in the city, but a strange stillness just off the edge of his vision. At the far corner near the entrance to a coffee shop, he saw them. 3 boys. One was visibly weak, barely upright, and leaning heavily on the shoulders of the other 2. The sight was so out of place it jarred something loose in him. The boys looked alike. Same age, same narrow faces, same dark brown hair, and pale skin. The only difference was that the smallest one seemed to be in pain. His face twisted with effort as he tried to keep moving. Henry frowned. He didn't do interruptions, but something made him pause. He stepped closer, ignoring the impatient buzz of his phone. "Hey," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's going on here? Is he hurt?" The taller of the 2 supporting boys glanced up at him. There was fear in his expression, but also something else. Exhaustion, maybe, or defiance. "He's sick," the boy said quietly. "His stomach hurts real bad." Henry crouched slightly to see the boy better. "You need to get him to a hospital." "Why are you out here like this?" The second boy, quieter than the first, shifted his weight and answered, "We can't go. We don't have money, and we don't have anyone." Henry's breath caught for a second, though he didn't show it. "Where are your parents?" The first boy answered, steady but sad. "Our mom died a few months ago. We don't know who our dad is. It's just us." His words were calm, practiced, even like he had explained it too many times. Henry stood silently, processing the information. His instincts screamed to move on. He had no idea who these boys were. This wasn't his problem. But something inside him, something he didn't recognize, tightened sharply at the image before him. They weren't asking for anything. They hadn't begged. They just stood there carrying their sick brother down a crowded sidewalk with nowhere to go and no one to help them. Henry took a deep breath, glanced at the time, and for the first time in years ignored his schedule. "Come with me," he said. "You're not doing this alone." The boys hesitated for a second, unsure if they should trust him, but eventually nodded. 1 on each side, still holding their brother. They followed him as he flagged down a taxi. What secret would unravel as they stepped into the car? As they climbed into the car, Henry looked at the smallest boy's face again. He was pale, sweating, and clearly in pain, but not crying. That was what struck Henry most of all. Not one of them had cried. They didn't act like kids. They acted like survivors. He sat back in the taxi seat, heart pounding with something that felt like urgency. It had been years since Henry Stewart had deviated from his carefully calculated routine. But this time, the detour felt like it might lead somewhere that mattered. The taxi ride to the clinic was tense and quiet. Henry gave the driver the address of a private hospital he occasionally used for executives and their families, a place that rarely dealt with cases like this. As the car moved through traffic, Henry glanced at the boys beside him. The sick one, Joshua, as the others soon told him, was drifting in and out of consciousness, his head resting against his twin brother Logan's shoulder. The third boy, Sam, sat closest to Henry, eyes darting between the city outside and his brother's pale face. They were holding themselves together with a kind of discipline that Henry recognized not from childhood, but from adulthood. They didn't fidget. They didn't complain. They just watched. It was deeply unsettling. When they arrived at the clinic, the receptionist started to speak but stopped the moment she saw Henry. He gave her one look and said simply, "Emergency pediatric now." She buzzed them through. Doctors took Joshua immediately, placing him on a stretcher and rolling him down the hall with swift efficiency. A nurse asked for information, name, age, medical history, and the boys answered together in short, practiced bursts. Their mother's name was Abby. She had died 3 months ago. The boys didn't know their exact birthdays, just that they were all 10. They'd been staying in a shelter on and off since Abby passed until they were told there wasn't room anymore. They had been on the street for 2 days. Henry sat in the waiting area with Logan and Sam as the staff worked on Joshua. The walls were white and sterile, decorated with soft pastel prints meant to calm children. The room felt too quiet, too clean, too far from where these boys had come from. Henry didn't know what to say to them. They weren't crying. They weren't asking questions. Logan was sitting stiffly like someone in a job interview. Sam, smaller by an inch or two, kept rubbing the sleeves of his oversized hoodie between his fingers. Eventually, Henry asked, "Do you have any other family?" Logan shook his head. "Just each other." His voice was thin, but even. "Do you know your father's name?" Henry asked. Logan looked down. "No. Mom never told us. She said he left before we were born. That's all we know." Henry nodded slowly. He felt like he was standing in the middle of someone else's life, trying to figure out what page he'd entered on. He leaned back in his chair, trying to steady the noise in his head. This wasn't a moment he could ignore anymore. He had already crossed a line. He had brought them here. He had stepped in. And now, whether he admitted it or not, he was part of whatever happened next. 2 hours passed before the doctor came back. Joshua had been diagnosed with acute appendicitis. He needed surgery, but the team was confident they had caught it in time. Henry stood when he heard the word surgery, already reaching into his coat for his wallet. Out of habit, as if money was the most important thing he could offer, the doctor waved him off. "We'll need a guardian to authorize the procedure," she said. Henry hesitated, then said, "List me. I'll take responsibility." The paperwork was swift, his name and signature carrying enough weight to bypass usual protocols. Once Joshua was in surgery, Henry returned to the waiting room where the twins were still seated in silence. He sat down between them. "Your brother's going to be okay," he said quietly. Logan let out a breath. Sam nodded but didn't say anything. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost companionable. As the sky outside darkened, Henry made a phone call. He didn't explain much to his assistant, only that his day was over and he would not be coming in the next morning. He ended the call and looked at the boys. "You're not going back to the street," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever, if I can help it." The words surprised even him. But they felt right. They felt final. Logan looked at him, unsure if he believed it. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Henry paused. Then for the first time that day, he gave them the truth. "Because someone should have helped you already. And no one did." Neither boy responded. But both leaned slightly toward him, not enough to be obvious, but enough for Henry to feel it. That night he stayed with them until the surgery was done and Joshua was resting. Then he called for a car and instead of giving the address to his penthouse, he gave the name of a nearby hotel. He wasn't ready to take them home, but he wasn't walking away. The hotel suite was quiet when they arrived, too large for 3 children and a man who still didn't know how to be what they might need. Henry had reserved it under a false name, unsure of what the legal process required, but knowing that these boys couldn't return to the streets. He watched Logan and Sam step cautiously inside, eyes scanning the furniture like it might not be real. They didn't ask for food or toys, or even where they would sleep. They sat down on the edge of one of the beds, close together, waiting for direction. It hit Henry then how little they expected from anyone. He called room service and ordered simple things. Mac and cheese, apples, orange juice. While they waited, he took out his laptop, not to check on business, but to search for social services procedures, emergency guardianship laws, anything that might guide him through what was quickly becoming a life-altering decision. Joshua was still in the hospital under observation, recovering well after surgery, and the hospital agreed to keep him for at least another day. But after that they would expect answers, papers, names, next of kin. Henry had none of those. The food arrived and Sam, the quieter of the two, whispered, "Thank you," before they ate. Logan didn't speak much, but he kept glancing at Henry as if trying to figure out whether this man could be trusted. Henry didn't try to explain himself. Instead, he sat nearby and watched them eat, noting how quickly they cleaned their plates, how they saved part of their juice as if it needed to last longer. It made his stomach knot. Later, he offered them a shower and pajamas, hotel robes, the only soft thing available in their size. Sam smiled for the first time when he found slippers in the closet, and said they looked like marshmallows. Transition to Millionaire in Love branding. Henry helped lay out a few extra pillows on the bed and sat at the desk while they got ready. When he looked up, they were curled under the covers together, whispering quietly. He stood, walked over, and asked if they needed anything else. Logan looked up at him, serious and small, and asked, "Can you stay in the room with us?" It was the first time he'd asked for anything directly. Henry nodded and sat in the armchair by the window. He left the lights low and listened as their whispers faded into steady breathing. The room grew still, and for the first time in years, so did he. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what to do about the DNA test burning a hole in the back of his mind. The test he'd quietly ordered when the hospital asked if there was a family member to match the boys' medical records. Something about the way they looked, the way their mother's name felt familiar, had unsettled him. And now the possibility that they weren't just strangers, but his own blood hung heavy in the air. He didn't want to believe it until he had proof. And yet, even as the logical part of his brain told him to wait to protect himself, his body had already moved. He'd already stayed. He'd already fed them, brought them into his space, signed paperwork at the hospital as though they were his. He'd already chosen them. That night, while the city blinked outside the windows and the boys slept soundly in a place that didn't feel like theirs yet, Henry leaned his head back and closed his eyes, the quiet of the room wrapping around him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his life not as pressure, but as potential, not as something to manage, but as something to share. And it terrified him how much he already cared. The following morning, Henry woke before the sun, just as he always had. But instead of checking his email or scanning financial reports, he simply sat in the armchair by the window and watched the sky lighten over the city skyline. The room was still dim, quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the two boys still asleep in the bed. They hadn't moved much during the night. Logan's arm was stretched protectively across Sam's chest, and their heads were tilted slightly toward each other, like even in sleep, they needed to stay connected. Henry had always thought of silence as a tool, something he used to stay in control. But now, it felt like a space he didn't quite know how to fill. When the boys woke, it was slow and groggy. They didn't spring up or stretch like most children might. Instead, they blinked a few times, sat up cautiously, and looked at Henry to see if they were still allowed to be there. He nodded and asked if they were hungry. Sam gave a tiny nod in return, and Logan muttered something about pancakes. Henry picked up the hotel phone and placed the order without hesitation, then turned back to them. "You're safe here," he said, not because it was expected, but because he needed to hear himself say it out loud. Sam blinked at him and Logan just watched him, quiet but alert. While they ate, Henry opened his laptop again and pulled up the lab results he had received earlier that morning. The DNA report was clear and irrefutable. The boys were his. All three. There wasn't even a question. The mother, Abby Monroe, had listed no father on any records, but she hadn't lied. She had simply left the space blank. As Henry stared at the screen, he felt the full force of reality settle over him like a second skin. These children weren't just a moral obligation or a strange coincidence. They were his sons. He sat with the knowledge for a long time before he said anything. After breakfast, when Logan and Sam were sitting on the floor drawing with hotel pens on the notepad from the nightstand, Henry spoke carefully. Do you remember your mother talking about someone named Henry? Logan looked up immediately. She did once. She said that was your name, but she told us not to try and find you. Said you were gone a long time ago. Henry's breath caught, but he nodded slowly. She and I knew each other. A long time ago. I didn't know about you. Not until now. Logan didn't say anything, but Sam looked at him with a strange intensity, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Are you our dad? He asked, the words soft and clear. Henry took a moment, then said, Yes, I am. The moment hung in the air. Logan's expression didn't change much, but his hands stilled on the paper. Sam tilted his head and said, Okay, as if accepting something that had already begun to feel true. Later that afternoon, they visited Joshua in the hospital. He was awake, groggy, but smiling at the sight of his brothers. When Logan told him the news, Joshua didn't respond with shock. Instead, he just said, I thought so, and reached for Henry's hand. The touch wasn't hesitant. It was small, warm, and full of quiet belief. Henry hadn't known what kind of father he would be, hadn't even considered that he might be one. But in that moment, with all three boys looking at him like they wanted him to stay, he made a decision. He wasn't going to fix everything overnight. He couldn't erase the years they had spent alone. But he could show up. He could stay. That evening, they returned to the hotel together. Joshua was discharged with strict recovery instructions, and Henry carried him into the suite like he weighed nothing at all. He let the boys watch cartoons late into the night and didn't care that they left crumbs on the sheets or scattered socks across the floor. They fell asleep piled together, not because they had to, but because that's where they felt safest. Henry stood in the doorway for a long time watching them. He didn't recognize the version of himself he was becoming, but he didn't fear him either. He just knew this. The life he had built had never truly belonged to him. But this one, the one with crayons on the table and tiny feet on the carpet, might, and for the first time, that was enough. The next few days passed in a blur that felt both strangely calm and entirely unfamiliar to Henry. Each morning began not with meetings or market updates, but with three small boys tumbling around a hotel room trying to decide who got to pick the breakfast. Joshua was recovering well from his surgery, still a little weak and sore, but strong enough to argue over cartoons and insist on sitting in the middle whenever they watched movies. Logan had begun to relax, though cautiously. He still scanned the room before entering, still made sure everyone had what they needed before serving himself, still glanced at Henry like he was waiting for the rules to change. Sam, the smallest and quietest, had become the most curious. He followed Henry around the room, asked questions about his watch, about why he always wore the same shoes, about whether his tie had to match his socks. Henry had moved them into a long-stay suite with a kitchenette and 2 bedrooms. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it gave them space to breathe. He bought clothes for each of them, not from high-end stores, but from practical ones, letting the boys help choose colors and styles. It surprised him how quickly they took to organizing their drawers and arguing over who got which shelf in the mini fridge. They were children, after all, and despite everything they'd been through, the spark of play still lived inside them. But the truth of their connection, the DNA results, the fact that they were his sons, pressed deeper into his chest with each passing hour. He had told them, and they had accepted it with a kind of quiet resilience. But he hadn't yet decided what to do about it publicly. The world he came from was sharp and fast and rarely kind. Announcing that he had 3 10-year-old children with no warning, no backstory, and no plan would draw attention he wasn't ready for. But hiding them felt worse. The thought of sending them anywhere else, of placing them in some system where he wasn't allowed to be part of their daily lives, made his throat close. He began working with a lawyer who specialized in private guardianship cases. The process would be complicated, especially since Abby had left no legal documentation, no will, no custody designation, just a letter found in a folder of school papers written in her neat, slanted handwriting that read, "If anything happens to me, please try to find their father. His name is Henry." He wasn't cruel, just gone. When Henry read those words, he sat still for nearly an hour. Gone. Not bad. Not absent on purpose, just gone. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't blame either. It was an honest truth from a woman who had raised their sons alone, who had made decisions he would never fully understand, but who had left the door cracked just enough for him to walk back through. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep with popcorn between the sheets and cartoon voices still echoing from the television, Henry sat at the small desk in the corner of the suite. He opened his laptop and typed a message to his board of directors. It was short and clear. He was taking a leave of absence. Effective immediately, personal reasons. He closed the computer before he could second-guess it. Then he walked into the boys' room, turned off the television, and pulled the blankets over each of them. Joshua had his arms sprawled across Logan, and Sam had one hand curled around a toy car. Henry watched them for a long time, the room full of their quiet breaths, and the kind of peace he had once believed was impossible to earn. He didn't know what kind of father he would be. He didn't have a plan for what came next. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. He was building something not out of power or control, but out of presence, out of moments, out of love that arrived late, but fully formed, and he wasn't going anywhere. Henry's house hadn't changed in years. It was a sleek, modern space in the quiet hills outside the city, where glass walls reflected trees and silence ruled the hallways. Everything inside was carefully curated, neutral tones, steel accents, and not a single item out of place. It had been his sanctuary, a monument to discipline and detachment. But standing in the entryway with 3 boys at his side, backpacks slung over their shoulders and mismatched shoes squeaking on the polished floors, the house suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. He watched them step inside hesitantly, eyes darting over the towering ceilings and spotless surfaces. Logan paused by a wall of books. Sam ran his fingers along the edge of a leather couch. And Joshua, still moving more slowly as he recovered, sank carefully into the nearest armchair and looked around as though waiting for someone to say they didn't belong there. Henry cleared his throat. "It's yours now. All of it. You don't have to be careful." The boys didn't reply, but something in their posture softened just slightly. In the following days, the house transformed, not because Henry forced it to, but because the presence of children simply refused to be ignored. There were shoes left by the door, drawings taped to the fridge, stuffed animals peeking from behind curtains, and a soccer ball that somehow always ended up in the dining room. Henry stopped adjusting cushions after they were disturbed, stopped wincing at handprints on glass, and started noticing the laughter that echoed down hallways that had once known only quiet. Meals became an adventure. He tried to cook a few times and failed spectacularly. The boys didn't seem to mind the burned toast or undercooked pasta, mostly because they were fascinated by the idea of a man in a suit trying to learn how to flip pancakes. Eventually, he hired a part-time cook, not to take over, but to teach him. He wanted to learn. He wanted to be there for everything, even the parts he didn't know how to do yet. At night, they piled onto the massive sectional in the living room, choosing movies with loud soundtracks and ridiculous plots. Sam fell asleep first every time, curled in a corner with his feet tucked under Henry's leg. Joshua stayed awake longer, asking questions about everything from space to animals to why water boiled. Logan was always the last to speak, but when he did, it was usually to thank Henry for something small. Clean socks, a warm blanket, a ride to the park. Henry kept meeting with lawyers. The guardianship process moved forward, and eventually he filed for full adoption. The paperwork was extensive. The interviews were intrusive. There were moments when he felt like he was being tested for something no one could ever fully prepare for. But every time someone asked, "Why are you doing this?" he answered honestly. "Because I should have been there from the start. And I won't miss another day." One afternoon, while reorganizing the boys' closet with Logan, Henry opened a small box he didn't recognize. Inside were old photos, folded notes, and a hospital bracelet. Logan looked up and said, "Mom kept it all. She just didn't know if we'd ever find you." Henry ran his fingers over a picture of Abby holding 3 tiny infants, eyes tired, but proud. It was the first time he'd seen her in years. He closed the box gently and told Logan he was glad she did. The boys started school a few weeks later. The first day, Henry stood outside the front gate, watching them disappear into the crowd of children. He felt a strange ache in his chest. Not fear, not sadness, but something closer to pride. They were walking into the world with heads held high, no longer invisible. That evening, they brought home stories and drawings and a note from the teacher saying, "They talk about you all the time. Whatever you're doing, it's working." That night, after they had all gone to bed, Henry sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea he didn't remember making. The house was quiet again, but not empty. There was life in every corner now, proof of joy layered over grief, of growth built on ruins he hadn't even known were his to rebuild. He didn't think of himself as a savior. He didn't want credit. He just knew that the man he used to be, cold, distant, defined by success, no longer existed in this space. This version of him was learning. This version of him was real. And this home, chaotic and noisy and full of crumbs, was finally where he belonged. It was early spring when Henry received a small package with no return address. The envelope was handwritten and slightly weathered, sealed with care, but clearly aged. He almost didn't open it, assuming it was a delayed delivery or misplaced correspondence from one of the many legal channels he'd been navigating. But when he saw the name Abby Monroe written in delicate, slanted letters on the top page inside, his breath caught. The letter wasn't recent. It was dated more than a year ago, long before the boys had entered his life. And yet somehow it had found its way to him. He read it alone in his office, the one room in the house that still looked like the version of himself he used to be. Orderly, untouched by the laughter and fingerprints that now filled the rest of the home. The letter was short, but honest in a way that twisted something deep inside his chest. Abby had written it when she'd already known she was sick. She hadn't said what exactly, only that her time felt short. She wrote that she didn't know if he'd ever read this or if he even remembered her. She told him she had 3 sons, his sons, and that she didn't regret keeping them even though it had been hard. She hadn't told him because she thought he wouldn't care or worse, would see them as a burden. But she hoped that if they ever found him, if the universe somehow connected them again, he'd try to understand. Henry folded the letter and held it in both hands, sitting very still. He thought of the boys, of Sam's curious eyes, of Logan's quiet strength, of Joshua's stubborn resilience, and wondered how different everything might have been if he'd received this letter earlier. But regret was not the emotion that stayed with him the longest. What lingered was gratitude, not just for the truth, but for the fact that Abby had believed, even in her final days, that he might become the man she had once hoped he would be. He didn't tell the boys about the letter immediately. He wasn't sure if it would hurt or comfort them, and he didn't want to bring back pain they had only just begun to move through. But a few nights later, during a rainy evening, when the power flickered and they were all curled up on the couch with flashlights and a board game, Logan asked a quiet question. "Do you think Mom knew you'd find us?" Henry hesitated. Then he reached for the envelope he'd kept in the drawer behind him and handed it to Logan. "I think she hoped," he said. "And I think she was right, too." They read it together, the boys pressing close to see the small, slanted handwriting. Sam asked if he could keep it in his room. Henry said yes. That night, they didn't ask for a story before bed. Instead, Logan turned off the light, and the 3 of them sat in silence, as if remembering something they hadn't lived, but still somehow carried. In the following days, Henry noticed a shift. The boys seemed a little more anchored, like knowing that their mother had made a choice to protect them, even if it meant leaving questions unanswered, gave them permission to let go of the fear that she had abandoned them. They talked about her more openly. Sam asked if she liked music. Joshua asked if she had ever cooked spaghetti wrong. Logan wanted to know what she had been like when she was happy. Henry answered the best he could. Sometimes guessing, sometimes remembering. He didn't pretend to know everything. He just made space for her to live in their home the only way she could. Now, through stories, drawings, and small keepsakes tucked into dresser drawers. On the last Sunday of the month, they planted a tree in the backyard. It wasn't for ceremony or closure. It was just something they wanted to do. Sam picked a flowering cherry because he said it looked like a tree from one of his picture books. They dug the hole together, Henry doing most of the work while the boys handed him tools and argued about who would water it first. When it was done, they stood in a circle around the small, trembling sapling and didn't say anything for a while. The wind moved gently through the branches. It was quiet, but not heavy. It felt like the kind of silence that holds memory rather than pain. Later that night, when Henry walked past the boys' room to turn off the hall light, he heard Logan's voice, not whispering, but steady. "I think Mom would have liked it here." And Henry, standing alone in the hallway, smiled. Not the polished smile of a man closing a deal, but the quiet one of someone who had finally come home. The 1-year anniversary of the day Henry met the boys arrived with little ceremony, but its weight was undeniable. He hadn't marked the date on a calendar, and no one said anything about it out loud, but it was there in the way he paused when passing the front door that morning, the same place he had once opened to strangers who turned out to be his sons. It was in the way Logan lingered a little longer at breakfast, or how Sam kept asking to look at old photos, or how Joshua, usually full of chatter, seemed unusually still. Henry didn't plan a celebration. He didn't know how to. But when the boys came home from school and found a stack of new board games on the table, a handmade cake in the kitchen, and 3 small gift boxes labeled only with their names, they understood. It wasn't about balloons or decorations. It was about presents. It was about making sure they knew that this day meant something, even if it wasn't called anything official. That evening, they ate dinner on the patio under strings of soft lights Henry had hung himself awkwardly and unevenly the week before. The meal was simple. Grilled burgers, fries, lemonade, but the table was full of laughter and teasing in ketchup-stained napkins. Sam dropped a tomato slice into his lap. Joshua tried to convince everyone he'd grown 2 inches. Logan asked if they could play one of the new games outside in the dark. Henry said yes to everything. After they cleared the dishes and brought out the cake, Henry stood for a moment, unsure of whether to say anything. But Logan looked up and said, "Is this the day we met you?" Henry nodded, then cleared his throat and replied, "It's the day everything changed." The boys didn't ask him to explain. They didn't need to. They knew what he meant. When the stars came out, they moved to the grass and lay in a row, staring up at the night sky. Henry lay between Joshua and Sam with Logan just beside them. Sam reached for his hand without saying anything, and Henry held it, surprised still at how natural that felt. They talked about space, about whether anyone could live on Mars, about what it would be like to float in zero gravity. Joshua asked what stars were made of, and Henry gave the scientific answer, but Sam interrupted with, "I think they're just memories that glow." No one argued. The quiet that followed felt whole. Later, when the boys were in bed and the house was calm again, Henry walked through each room, and turned off the lights slowly. He picked up a sock in the hallway, a toy robot in the bathroom, a drawing that had slipped off the fridge. He didn't mind the clutter. It wasn't disorder, it was evidence, proof that his home was full of life. He stepped out onto the back porch with a cup of tea and looked at the tree they had planted months ago. It had grown just a little, its thin branches reaching upward with the stubborn grace of something that had survived its first storm. Henry watched it for a long time, remembering the version of himself who had once stood on a street corner, indifferent to everything but his schedule. He couldn't reconcile that man with the one he was now, and he didn't want to. He had been successful, wealthy, respected, but none of those things had made him complete. The boys had not by filling a void but by showing him one had always been there. They had never asked him to be perfect. They had only asked him to stay. And he had every day since. As the wind shifted and the porch lights flickered gently, Henry smiled. Not because everything was easy or fixed or flawless, but because for the first time in his life, everything truly mattered. And he finally knew who he was. A father, a home, a second chance he would never let go of.